What's up, guys? Chris here, and today I wanted to talk about comparing the world first races. Final Fantasy XIV just had our 5.4 Savage race, where we went through Eden, 9, 10, 11, and 12S, four separate fights, all on Savage, which is the difficulty above normal, below Ultimate. We only get two Ultimates per expansion. This is not one of them. This is obviously number 9, 10, 11, and 12 in our series of Savages here. We also got an extreme fight in our weapons where we have our 8-man trials that are running kind of parallel to this. Separate storyline, but ultimately if you're only playing for battle content, it's yet another fight that you can go off and play that is at a higher than normal difficulty. Meanwhile, over in World of Warcraft, we have our new expansion, and it is Shadowlands, Shadow, and we are in Castle Nathria. Castle Nathria is the first raid of the new expansion. It has 10 bosses, ending with Denathrius, and as of this point, those 9 have been cleared on Mythic. First, it was released on Normal and Heroic, which is their step above Normal, and then it jumps to Mythic, which I think is probably roughly similar to kind of that Unreal, or the Ultimate. It's very hard, but they get it every tier, so there's a lot more Ultimates per expansion in kind of 14 terms, as opposed to when you go over to 14, you really only kind of stop at that Heroic difficulty. So when people say, well, Savage isn't as hard as Mythic, well, I don't think those are really meant to be compared, but we'll get to that. And there are 10 fights, and then after Normal and Heroic drop, we then move into Mythic and LFR, the top difficulty and the bottom difficulty, kind of a story mode, very easy to clear. You can go through it with wipes, and people don't really have to understand mechanics. As long as they're banging their head into the keyboard with some rhythm, they will probably get it down. And then Mythic, which can be very, very punishing, and as of this recording, has not been cleared. As of this recording, we made it through full reset, so we went a full 7 days, and they only had 9 of 10. The top 2 guilds in the world were at 9 of 10. Everybody else was at 8 or less in Mythic, and a lot of that is because it's tuned to need the gear, and it drops less gear than in the past. And those top 2 guilds have done a great job of acquiring items that are, bind on equip, which means that people can trade them, as 14 would call it. They're not market prohibited, and that allows them to go around, and it actually results in some really interesting economy mechanics. Whether or not you like them, it is what's happening, where they go out and they spread their resources across a bunch of servers, and then they buy up all the things from different servers, and then they pay for character server transfers to get the items over. So it's an immense amount of both in-game and out-of-game money that is spent on this for these top 2 seats, but they get some very big sponsorships. And I'd be interested to see if 14 heads more that direction. There was a talk about Method maybe moving to covering the Final Fantasy XIV World First races, because they don't usually line up exactly with the WoW ones. And so for people who just like World First coverage, that competitive PvE raid type mentality, having more than one game, whether you like them equally, is really nice because it fills the gaps. And a lot of 14 players kind of pushed back out of the ones who kind of heard that they were thinking of doing that. Now, Method, of course, had a really rough last 12 to 24 months, as many know, and they've I think that's who makes up Echo, is large portions of Method, but I could be wrong on that roster. And instead, we had Frosty taking it to a whole new level. Frosty TV had commentators. They had coverage from multiple streams. Every raid team that was streaming, they were kind of covering the different ones. They were going through the different mechanics. They were touching in on different groups, looking at progression. That way, when one group took a break, they just pulled up another. They had different guests from all across the community, and it started to look a lot like this whole new thing happening in WoW. OTK, One True King, Asmongold and Rich Campbell and Esfon were all, they got together and they had a bunch of guests and various little side kind of gags and stuff, because sometimes when we get onto a boss that takes, 50, 100, 150 or more pulls, it gets a little repetitive. It gets a little where, like, you have to be understanding it at a pretty technical level to see the progress. You're really just looking for that percent health to come down over previous attempts. Even if they're getting better, if the percent isn't coming down, it's like, well, that kind of looks like the last 20 pulls. And so they can kind of make that into a more entertaining thing. And as I watched both these communities, I noticed that it kind of draws a similar crowd. Now, obviously, the numbers of people watching these streams, it's not like I can see the same people watching both streams, but it's a very similar audience. And one of the things that I noticed happened a lot is that both games every once in a while there'd be a little bit of blood in the water. Somebody would say something as a comparison of Final Fantasy XIV versus World of Warcraft, or the other way around, and then there would be this kind of memedom that would take place where the game kind of mocks the other game for either character flaws they believe that the entire community can stereotypically be grouped under, or the game having some flaw itself where it makes it less than. And for those of you that know kind of my background, I've played World of Warcraft since vanilla, only skipping Warlords of Draenor. And I have played Final Fantasy since A Realm Reborn 2.0, the relaunching. And so I've played both games a lot, hundreds and hundreds of hours, more likely classified in days, which is still large numbers. There are people who have played much more than me in each game, but I do have a fairly good level of understanding of how these games work at a casual level in both games. I am not at the top of either game. I don't raid in Ultimate. I don't raid in Mythic. I watch. It's a spectator thing. It's aspirational content for me. I'm thrilled the game supports that community. I love watching it. I have no interest in putting in the effort and the work to get to the level where you even get to attempt something like that, knowing full well that even if I did, I may not be able to clear it. It's about discipline. It's about showing up on time. It's about maintaining good attitude. It's about stamina for gaming, and it's about playing at a high mechanical skill level, and generally about making that game take a priority over a lot of other things, at least other games in your life, to get that. And thankfully there are people in both games that will rise to that level and put on one heck of a show for us, and it's a lot of fun to watch. It's a great thing for the community. So I hope developers of these games don't ever look at it as, you know, only 0.1% of the population clears this and only 1% even looks at it. We should just drop it. No. I think that these pieces of content draw all sorts of eyeballs. People who've never played the game before, casual people who just want to see what the best looks like. It draws a huge portion of the community together, at least here in the West. It's a big following. You see the numbers on Twitch. It's very exciting. Whether or not we ever have an intention of setting foot in that difficulty, I think it's awesome for the game. But what I wanted to make this video to kind of talk about here, now that I'm 7 minutes into the intro here, is that I saw some things being tossed back and forth that I think come more from a place of a lack of understanding, a lack of exposure to the other game, and it's easy to just kind of lump on once people start lumping onto one game, and you kind of miss the point. So first of all, I wanted to touch on difficulties. I talked about it a little bit just a bit ago, but let's just kind of back up. In Final Fantasy, we have several different forms of content. We have 4-man dungeons. Hard mode typically just means it's kind of leveled up, doesn't really mean it's any harder. And then that's it for dungeons. It doesn't ever get harder than that. We've asked for Mythic Plus. The developers have said, you know, something like a Mythic Plus type system. Keep in mind that Deep Dungeons is very different than Torghast, so I assume their M Plus would be very different. But, you know, we've asked for something. Many of the developers are huge fans of Diablo, so something that Greater Rift-esque, like where there's an affix that kind of modifies it and allows it to scale up and create replayability out of the small man content, and called a light party, 4-man. Which I really wish it was 5. Get more DPS in there, like wow. But that 4-man content really stops there. It doesn't ever get super duper hard. It just doesn't. Now they do have Deep Dungeon that compares with kind of Torghast, and there's 200 floors, and that gets very hard, but that's side content. That's when we just talk about Duty Finder versus, you know, when we just talk about queuing up for a typical dungeon, a place you'd get loot at the end, there's a handful of bosses, that typical experience, that stays casual. It is very narrative based. You can actually run it with NPCs if you want. In any of the dungeons that are tied to storyline, they've actually added this expansion, the ability to run those with NPCs from that portion of the story that, you know, that shares a different tone. They talk about it. You get a chance to take it at your pace, and then you can go in with other people who typically just pull to the wall, blast it all down, that more typical dungeon experience that a WoW player would be used to. In WoW, in that dungeons, we have normal content, and then we have heroic content, which steps it up just a touch. You have leveling dungeons in 60s, which is kind of the same. And then heroic is just a harder version of all of those, and it really just requires that you're kind of paying a little more attention. Once you've been established in the game, they don't actually feel that much harder, so you'd probably just prefer heroic unless you're just trying to go fast, because it makes normal almost seem boring. the number of mobs and stuff in these vary, but that's not what we want to get delved into here. We're trying to stay on world first topic. And then from there we move into Mythic Plus, and it's that it assigns affixes, it gets harder, it stacks up, the loot goes up, it's a whole thing. Now when we move up into larger group content, WoW immediately jumps into 10 or more. And it has a flex rating system and all of that, so you move into raids, 10 mans. And that can go from 10 to 25. 14 still has a couple of separations here. We have 8 mans, which is our raids and our trials, and then we have alliance raids, which are 3 8-man groups, which forms a 24-man, where you're in party A, B, or C, and so in various fights you'll split up. In various fights it's all 24 people together. Some fights it's a little bit of both. Those 24 mans never get harder. They're left kind of normal all the time. And so they're a lot of fun, but they're never really difficult. Yeah, that's it. They never get harder. So once you think it's easy to clear, it just gets cleared. And so once everybody starts to get gear, they get cleared every single week. They're kind of on that normal difficulty. Now they're not an LFR difficulty, so there are sometimes mechanics in them that will wipe the raid. But as long as everybody's kind of paying attention, and if they die, they listen to some advice in chat, we can typically push through. Unless one alliance is really struggling, because there's those 3 separate 8-mans, sometimes you're on separate platforms, and if one group just has a healer that can't keep up, or a tank that can't keep hate, or DPS that just won't hit the mark, or people won't obey mechanics and stand or something, the other 2 alliances, like, you can literally be standing on a platform, you can just watch them failing, and there's nothing you can do in some of these fights. Now, the middle is where everything interesting happens here. It's these 8-mans. You have trials and you have raids. Raids run in sequence. You queue for each boss individually, kind of like how LFR works, where you queue for each section of the raid, and it's just one. Sometimes there's trash, sometimes there's not. And trials stand on their own. You port right into the boss room and you go at it. On normal, these are something that you need to know what all the mechanics do, but usually many of the mechanics will not one-shot the whole group. They many times won't even one-shot one person, but if you miss them repeatedly, and usually it's a building type thing. Usually what'll happen is they'll show you a mechanic, might kill you, and then they'll show you that mechanic twice, and where it'll do it back to back, and if you get hit by both, you're going to die, and then it'll show you a different mechanic, and then twice, and then it'll stack them together. And so there's a building thing. Ground effects are very obvious in 14. They do not allow DBM, and so you're forced to, the game developers are forced to have callouts that function for people, as opposed to WoW does allow DBM, Deadly Boss Mods, an add-on that literally shouts out at you when to get out of things, and when to stun, and when to move, and when to stack, and all these things. And so that they have to design the content to be hard, even with something calling it out. So they have to find a way to do things that will challenge people who are having the perfect mechanics shouted at them. 14, you've got to read the mechanics. You've got to read telegraphs. You've got to read cast bars. So there's more paying attention. And so they've done a better job of making it to where, like, once you kind of see things, once you know that the arrow's facing in as a stack marker, that stack marker can change shape. It can move. There can be 2 of them. And you immediately know how that works. It's a different mechanic, but it pulls on kind of signage that you're used to, and so you adjust very, very quickly to it. And then where it gets hard is that they do DPS checks and healer checks just like in WoW, and they can be tuned very, very tightly as we move into their 2 higher difficulties. Raids go into Savage, Trials go into Extremes. You're really just moving one step up. These tune really hard. You have an unlimited number of battle reses, but when you res people, they have a form of weakness, so it's not really effective. It costs a lot of mana, it takes a lot of time, and if you're doing it repeatedly, in some fights, if you're doing it at all, you're not going to clear your check. So the restriction is not how you get people up if they die. It's that if they die, things typically go wrong. A lot of bosses will have things where if somebody dies, they just do the next mechanic. They're waiting for somebody to die, and they'll just do the next mechanic, so it'll wipe the raid. There are all sorts of things that penalize you for death, but the resurrecting, it's not limited. It just has a long cast time and costs lots of mana. There's a class, Red Mage, that can kind of get around that, but it just, you need people not to die. It's just 8-man, so it puts a little more pressure on the individual, because obviously with, when you go look at world first groups with 25, if one person dies, it doesn't immediately wipe the raid. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3, depending on how tightly tuned. Sludge Fist, we were watching them, and it's like, oh, one person went down, they'll be fine. They lose one every pull. Okay, 2 went down, it'd have to be pretty perfect. Okay, 3 went down, wipe it up. With 8-man, one person dies, you got to wipe it up. So everybody's got to be on point all the time. So it puts a little more individual responsibility on it. And that's just how that works. Now the classes, the gearing wise, gearing is a little simpler in 14. You're mostly just paying attention to eye level. There's a little bit of stat priority and stuff going on, but you're mostly paying attention to eye level. There's kind of two gear progressions. Their legendary system is called relics, and you're gearing that, you're leveling that up through the expansion, kind of like alternating with the Savage and Extreme content. So there's kind of a push and pull on that if you're truly seeking out best in slot, but for a casual player, it just provides options, kind of like how the Great Vault does in WoW. And with both of these difficulties, that's really it. That's the majority of our patch cycles. We get 5 patches per expansion. I don't remember how many WoW gets. I feel like it's less than 5. And you get a patch, you get a partial patch, and then you get a half patch. So right now we're in 5.4. We're about to go into 5.41, which will have side content. Then we'll go into 5.45, which will have that lateral, that truly lateral content where we level up our relics, versus 5.4 where we're leveling up in more dungeon style content. So it just varies. Their relic system currently takes place in like a Maw type zone, but imagine a Maw where you have to run together instead of a Maw where you always want to run apart. So they're just different. That's where that takes place. Twice per expansion, they get an ultimate, and an ultimate is meant to punish you into the ground. It is meant to just shove your face into the ground because you asked for this. You asked to cry. We're not going to nerf it. They never nerf it. They don't allow you to go in unsynced where your level, so if you're level 80 right now and you want to go run the one from last expansion, it will bring you down to the eye level, that the max eye level that would have been impossible at that time. It'll drop you down to level 70. You'll get your full toolkit. You'll get your full set of spells as they were. So like you're just stuck. It doesn't ever get easier. It doesn't, you go back to being level 70. You literally get scaled down to level 70 as opposed to World Sync in WoW where you're just a level 80 and the boss gets brought up to 80. They call that term Unreal. They've just started adding those. We get 1 per patch, and where they resurrect an old boss and bring it up kind of like time walking. And that's really it, guys. Those 2 are the big ones. So the truly hardcore have these huge gaps. And so you end up with not as many statics, statics are what they call kind of raid groups. You end up with people making the content, it can be more social. It's just different. It's just different. That's all it is. It's different. The World First Race this time was run by Frosty, does a podcast, has handled them in the past, but ran it at a whole nother level this time. And it was a lot of fun. You have content creators sharing theirs. The top group never streams theirs. TPS, the people who won this time, they don't stream, so it's a mix, which I know is controversial this time in the World First Race in WoW. And that catches WoW players up a bit on how things work in Final Fantasy. I glossed over 9 million terms. I simplified it all the way down. So don't get frustrated, Final Fantasy people. Just know that I'm about to make WoW people just as angry when I oversimplify all of this for you. So in World of Warcraft, now jumping over, we're in our raids, and you have those 4 difficulties I described. You have your story level, which releases slowly and in chapters, kind of like raids over here, but instead of just 1 boss, there is trash because we have 10 bosses to divide into probably 3 chunks, we'll see. And so our first one here, we have 3 bosses. The next one, I assume, will have 3 bosses, and then the last one, maybe 3, and then Denathrius by himself, maybe 4, maybe it's 4 sections, I don't know. But they'll release slowly, they'll trickle out, right? Because just like in 14 with our half patch, they have long patch cycles, and they want to kind of keep people interested, retention mechanics, as sometimes these devs call them. And so above LFR, you have normal. Normal, you just need to be respectful. You just need to pay attention. If everybody's doing their job, if you all read the adventure journal, you know what you're doing, and you tried to get some gear, and you brought a flask, and you gave a crap, you'll probably get it down. It's a question of, can you have the right number of people, show up on time, and care? Now, to go above that, you move into heroic. Heroic is kind of their savage, guys. It really is. The mechanics matter. Groups wipe easy. It can be very tough. It depends on the raid tier. This particular one has been pretty punishing on casual guilds for normal and heroic, but they're, to mythic level players, to your ultimates, they don't feel that different. It's just pay more attention. The thing that you were already trying to avoid because it almost killed you, it will kill you now. So if you're already playing perfectly, a jump to heroic's not as big of a deal. But if you were making mistakes and you were sliding by a normal, heroic is going to punch you in the face really hard. And that'll be where many casual guilds that kind of just do one night a week, maybe 2 casual nights a week, they laugh, they drink, they have a good time. That'll be where they stop. That is where the vast majority of the population stops. But they have Ultimate every single tier. And they have, it's called Mythic, and they have it of every boss every time. It adds secret phases, just like what happened in 12S. It does all of this interesting stuff, but it's doing it every time. There's a big world first race. It's currently put on by OTK, Asmongold, and all of them. It was a surprisingly delightful to watch. I was really impressed with how well polished it was, with the level of infrastructure they were able to spin up for this. And I look forward to seeing where both of these world first kind of organizations take things from here, especially as they're able to secure more sponsorships and move into a more funded thing. The Final Fantasy one this time was for charity, and I know a lot of people really like that, and you feel good about that. But for them to go more for the Ultimate race, it wouldn't shock me if they have to go away from charity so that they can take those proceeds and start to pay these content creators that were taking time to appear, because the Savage races, because it is kind of that heroic level, it ends in a few days. But the Ultimate race, longest Ultimate, I think took like 67 days or something. So for all you WoW players to say, well, they only get 2, just know they're real hard. So like they can, and they don't nerf them. They're like, in WoW, people will complain for a nerf, and sometimes we'll get one. Yeah, they don't nerf. They don't nerf. There aren't as many bugs because it's just the one boss, but they don't nerf. There's been a lot of bugs in this WoW one. There's been things where there's an interesting dynamic, because you have, instead of it being a worldwide release, you have staged releases. And so because you have so many more Mythic Raiders, you have to stage it out so the patches are stable. NA comes up first, but that also means that if there's going to be an extended unforeseen maintenance, it hits NA the hardest, so they lose that lead. EU comes on, makes for an interesting race because they're on at different times. And it's a race to who finishes the last boss first. People keep track of who gets each one along the way. We really look for that 10 of 10. Who got the final boss? However many bosses there are per tier. Who gets Denathrius down first? That's the real winner. And that's probably who gets the best sponsorship deals. We never really see that side of the business. And that's Mythic. Okay? Now, what you do going into this, both games have splits. Both games optimize DPS. They work very differently. So the way splits work in 14, they haven't been needed every tier, but when they are, you go in with 4 mains and 4 alts. Because the content is so hard and each person matters, those are not fill-ins. Those are the actual all 8 players in most cases that I've seen. I could be wrong on that. Where it's 4 mains and 4 alts, you funnel gear to the mains. Square didn't really like that you were doing that, so they actually kind of have shifted the loot cycle. It's kind of discouraged it, so it hasn't really been as needed, but that is how splits work. And you literally just will run, your main tank, and then somebody else will bring a tank as the off tank, and your main healer and an off healer, and so on. And so you'll just go in there and you'll clear it that way. And then you'll switch and you'll run it again. In WoW, when things drop, they drop based on armor type, because since each class can be multiple specs, you have things where you have a plate wearer like a paladin that could be a healer or a tank. And so they may have a chest piece that is just plate, and it will have stats on it that will switch based on what spec you have between, strength and intellect, or however that works. And so you want to funnel that loot over. And so they run splits. They got less loot. For 25 people, they only get 3 pieces per boss. So 30 pieces once they're full clearing. 27 for this week when they're going into Denathrius, and they got through 9 last week. And that's what they get. And so the way they run splits is they run them based on armor type. So they'll set up a full raid. Sometimes they'll go out to basically their equivalent of Party Finder, Group Finder, and they'll fill it with strangers, and they just blast this stuff down on Heroic, and they funnel the loot to those people. That's the plan. They'll run their own splits, or they'll invite people in. It can be a real mess because it's a lot of bodies to fill. And then they have to run splits for plate, for leather, for cloth. It can result in a lot. If the loot gets any more restrictive, I heard them joking, you know what, we'd just run a split once for every character. We'd run the raid 25 times. So the time commitment between Ultimate players, where they give up a couple days off work and they try really hard in the nights leading up to, as opposed to these people play 15 hours a day from the launch of the expansion through the raid coming out sometimes. They just put in these crazy hours. The WoW side of things is so much more professional because it has so much more content to clear, so it can have so many more eyeballs on it, so there's a lot more sponsorship money, so people can afford to put more time in. I think most of the people in in the 14 are either full-time content creators where they do all sorts of content for 14 and raiding is just part of that, or they have jobs. On the WoW side of things, you have people who are just PvPers. You have people who are just raiders. That's what they do. There's an invitational for Mythic Plus. There's all these things. It is more competitive, and it's bred a different environment. And what's interesting is both game devs seem to feel the same about it. Yoshi P does not want that for his game and actually gets concerned when he sees people pulling too long of shifts without taking breaks. He actually wonders if maybe he should pull that sort of thing from the game. They've talked about moving to 3 ultimates, but he doesn't like what designing ultimates does to his devs. He said that they have to put a ton of work in. And so he worries about what that does for just creating a game that's unhealthy for its players. Ian Hanakostas, on the other hand, WoW's Yoshi P, says a very similar set of things. He says the World First Race is a community event. It is not and will not and should not be run by Blizzard. It is not what they designed for. It is not how they schedule patches for. It is not what they planned for. They plan for this to be clearable by everybody and be really hard if you want to clear fast. Let you do with that what you may. There have been expansions where they don't really like to advertise world first, server first, all of that, because it does lead to an unhealthy consumption of their game. And honestly, they spend all this time meticulously designing these zones and these quests and these raids, and then people will just blast through it as fast as they can, and then they come out the other side, they go, what's next? And it's like, you didn't even stop to appreciate what I made. So the WoW devs are just like Yoshi P. They show it differently in their actions, but you see it when you see the fact that it's not a worldwide world first release. In the world first streams, you see people frustrated that it's not a worldwide release. They're not doing this for this 1%. They're not doing it for the 70,000 people watching and the 200 people competing. They're doing this for the 10 million people. So whether you agree with that or not, that's what they're doing. And both games kind of, so really I just wanted to make this video to just kind of show that once you understand how both games work, just a tiny bit, I'm glossing over a ton, trying to get through this in under 30 minutes. And I'm just saying that it's different. They're different games, but I also want you to realize that as I describe how different they are, when you look out at other games, you need to realize you're on the same team. If you're a big fan of a sports team and your sports team has a rival in the same sport, right? Football, baseball, whatever. When you guys are hanging out, watching the game, you guys are racing against each other, go nuts, talk trash, have a good time. But just remember that when you go to hang out with somebody who's a fan of a different sport and doesn't care about your sport, the things they don't care about the sport apply to both of you equally. It's the same crap. I don't like the way your team plays baseball any more than the way your team plays baseball. I don't like baseball. MMORPGs are the same thing. The core mechanics are the same. We have reputations to grind, we have quests to complete, we have characters to level, we have professions to take part in as side content, we have group content to do together, we have narrative experiences telling us a story with cutscenes and with some voice acting and a lot of reading and quest texts and books on the ground you can interact with. We have worlds that are beautiful with soundtracks that sum them up. We have PvP, we have pets we can gather, mounts we can gather, ways we can change the way our character looks, different races to choose from, different classes to play that break across three key roles with tanks, healers, DPS, with melee and range not really feeling like they're the same thing. It's all there. It's all the same thing. It's two different ways to look at the exact same feature list. When that feature list runs into a problem, how do I create lateral side content that doesn't break the outside battle system? Both games have a similar solution. We have Deep Dungeon, where you get to go in and you get to manipulate the way things work and the way you interact with monsters. We have Torghast, where you manipulate the way your character works and the way you interact with monsters. We have the Maw, where you interact with the world in a different and scarier way. We have Bozja, where you have open world bosses that are just insanity that would never function in the open world. Even, like, they're just different than hunts. They do different things. They literally duel people and they single them out. Insanity going on in Bozja. We have all of the same things. They're the same ingredients. They've been put together in a slightly different way with a slightly different emphasis, and we've gotten two different products. But if somebody doesn't like MMORPGs, they're not going to want to play one of these games over the other. They just don't like them. It's the same features. So before I see more of this trash where there's just people talking, stop and ask, how does your game do it differently? Because I promise these devs do that. Yoshi P and Ian's teams talk directly with each other. They have private invites to each other. They both get invited to the other one's festivals. We met Blizzard employees at FanFest. We've hung out with, like, we know that for a fact that Yoshi P was at BlizzCon. We know that they're doing this. They don't view each other as rivals, just like people on those sports teams may take vacations with each other's families. Meanwhile, their fans are beating each other up in a bar. They see it as the same sport, and they're competing against each other in the same sport. I don't know why we as fans have to tear each other down, and I just wanted to create this video to kind of show that the World First races were both a blast to watch. Thank you so much, Frosty TV. Thank you so much, OTK. You guys have made this enjoyable. You've brought the community together. It's been a ton of fun. I hope you both keep doing it. I wish you guys the best. I hope you both get tons of sponsorships and support from the community, and you feel like you can make this bigger and more of what your vision for it is, because I had a blast seeing what you guys made out of something that is just a community-driven event for content that we all share. It's awesome. They're two games that I love. They're two games that are both going great right now. Shadowlands, a ton of fun. Shadowbringers, a ton of fun. They're different kinds of fun, but they're in the same vein, and I find that I appreciate them more individually when I compare them to each other and when I have them right side by side. And I think that if more people understood how the other game works and why their game made some different decisions, they would see that the strengths and the weaknesses go together and they make your unique game. And that if you ever need a break from it, there's another one that might be a fresh place to go try out. And then you can always go back. You can main one and secondary the other, and it can go either way. So hopefully, if you guys had any questions on any of those sections, I'd love to expand more. I already am at 30 minutes, and I would love to kind of show you guys. There's a lot of individual subjects there to compare directly and just translate the lingo, show you the difference in the way they handle things, show you how these games are handling the same content in two different ways to create two similar, wonderfully different, wonderfully awesome pieces of content to consume for roughly $15 a month. Thank you so much for watching. I just wanted to talk about this. It's not really news. It's not necessarily a guide. It's just me talking about gaming, kinda. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.